to 99. It should have been 25.
If it was a white woman that got killed by a black person, they would have got life.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm your host, Lisa Snowden-McCray. Former Dallas police officer Amber Geiger has been sentenced to 10 years for the 2018 death of Texas man Botham Jean. Geiger's sentencing was yesterday, but what people are still talking about is the show of emotion that happened in the courtroom. Shortly after Geiger was sentenced, Botham's brother, Botham Jean, told the court that he forgave Geiger for his brother's death and gave her a hug.
If you truly are sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you.
Judge Tammy Kemp, who presided over the case, also hugged Geiger and gave Geiger her personal Bible, telling her, quote, "You need a tiny mustard seed of faith. You start with this." Jean's mother was a little more critical in her statements after the sentencing.
Yesterday, we saw the conviction of Amber Geiger, and today we heard the sentence of 10 years in prison. That 10 years in prison is 10 years for her reflection and for her to change her life. But there is much more to be done by the city of Dallas. The corruption that we saw during this process must stop. And it must stop for you. Because after now, I leave Dallas, but you live in Dallas. And it must stop for everyone.
It begs a few questions. Would Geiger have been treated this way if she was black? Are black people compelled to forgive those who hurt them? Today, I'm talking with Real News host Jacqueline Luqman about why this story is so compelling. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So we were talking a little bit before the camera started rolling about how you heard about what happened in the courtroom, ironically a little bit, after you came home from church, because a lot of the conversation was around how it was so great that the victim's family was being so forgiving and how that's a Christian thing to do. What was your take on that?
Well, my take is that people, especially Christians and particularly Black Christians, have a very skewed interpretation of the doctrine of forgiveness as it's preached and taught in especially American Christian churches. We're taught that we're supposed to, especially Black people, are taught that we're never supposed to be angry at what is done to us. And it doesn't matter if it's someone who steals from us, or if it's an example of extrajudicial killing of an unarmed Black person by law enforcement. We're just never supposed to be angry. We're always supposed to be meek and humble, and we're supposed to automatically, immediately forgive whatever anyone does to us. And that is a doctrine that is not biblical. It's a misinterpretation of what forgiveness is in the biblical sense. And it's also not a form of forgiveness that's practiced by many white Christians. So there are a lot of different angles in that where we can look at how white supremacist ideology has misinterpreted and warped scriptures to control, at first, formerly enslaved people, and how those scriptures came out of an ideology of supporting empire in the first place when they were written, because we're talking about the difference between the epistles and the gospel of Jesus Christ, which directly confronts and challenges unjust authority. But what's taught around forgiveness in the Bible is usually centered around the epistles or the letters that came after the gospel that focus a lot on obeying all kinds of authority. And that's what we're taught.
It makes me think about, even with everything kind of these days goes back to Donald Trump, unfortunately. But when you look at his polling numbers, the people who are most consistently with him are white evangelical Christians. It's like,
yes.
And it also makes me think about, you know, when there were slaves were compelled a lot of times to go to church with their masters and stand in the back. It's always been like this warping of religion to kind of, meld with the United States' long history of anti-Blackness?
Absolutely. I mean, we don't have enough time to go into all of the connections, but I love that you brought up that point that, this was a tool, the misinterpretation of these scriptures to control oppressed and enslaved people was a tool that the empire, that the slaveholding class used to control people. But when those enslaved and oppressed people actually were given the opportunity to read the scriptures themselves, they found in those very same scriptures a very different representation of the Christian God. This deity was someone who they found in the scriptures was on the side of the oppressed. He fought for justice, and he compelled people who were believers to fight for justice on behalf of the oppressed. But this is one of the reasons why reading was prohibited among enslaved populations, so that message of liberation could not be imparted to those people. But it got through anyway, because this very same faith is what people like Nat Turner and John Brown and Denmark Vesey and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Marcus Garvey and others use to fight for liberation for oppressed people. So we don't have the historical narrative of the scriptures themselves and of the Christian faith in regard to Black liberation. And that's one of the reasons why we think that what happened in that courtroom was what forgiveness is supposed to look like for Black people who call themselves Christians.
So what do we do? I know that when Geiger was even found guilty, in my circles, people were shocked. People were shocked that she was even found guilty. There's not too many instances in the United States of a person who was a police officer being held accountable for taking a Black life. So we got to there. We got to the sentencing, which, we can even argue about whether that was enough time or not. But where do we go from here? Where do Black people go from here? If we are not compelled to forgive, what are the alternatives for us?
Well, first, I think you also raise a good point about the sentencing and the fact that she was found guilty, which is unusual. But even among the Black radical circles and the activists, we were looking at the situation from the guilty verdict and saying, okay, she's been found guilty, but let's not celebrate, because we know that there's going to be some shenanigans with the sentencing, because we've seen this before. So, and then that's what happened. The sentence could have been up to 99 years for murder, and she was granted a sentence of 10 years with the possibility of parole in 5.
Yeah.
If she, behaves herself in prison. People who sell crack have gotten sentenced to prison for more time. Yeah. So we understand that there is an inequity, a serious racial inequity that exists in the justice system, so-called justice system. And we have to keep pointing that out, as Botham Jean's mother so eloquently did, that people in Dallas still have to live with that corruption and that injustice in Dallas. So we have to keep fighting on those fronts and challenging the authority that allows these things to happen. And that includes challenging the judge, who is a Black woman, and calling into account the behavior of the bailiff, another Black woman, and recognizing—
Who was the one who was stroking her hair.
Yes, and making her presentable and comfortable before the sentencing. And we have to recognize that even Black people in positions of authority will sometimes uphold the very system of white supremacy and oppression that we endure as we go through these challenges. And as far as forgiveness is concerned, forgiveness is just from a biblical, spiritual perspective. It's a personal thing for for everyone, depending on their own personal proclivities. But if we're just talking about in the Christian faith, forgiveness is a process that includes inputs and measurable behaviors from the perpetrator of the person who requires forgiveness.
Yeah.
This is a part of the forgiveness narrative that even Christians don't understand, is a requirement for the process. It is not just a quick, you've done me wrong, and for me to be a good Christian or for me to be a good person of spiritual belief, I have to immediately forgive you, and you're released from responsibility for making anything right of what you've done. That's not what the doctrine of forgiveness is in the Christian faith tradition. It involves quite a bit more than that. It involves true contrition, and it involves a changing of the perpetrator's behavior away from those actions that warrant forgiveness. And then when those things are genuinely done, then we can talk about forgiveness. But usually even then, it doesn't require hugging people who murdered your loved one in a courtroom. But
Well, Jacqueline, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am Lisa Snowden-McCray, and you've been watching the Real News Network.